Let's thank Bayo again for just an incredible moment here. Thank you for staying with us and for your incredible questions. We have worked during the break to try to weave them together into a tapestry. You may hear words or phrases from your question in what gets asked, but I want you to know, and some of these are stories and offerings for you, Bayo, and so I want you to know that what you've written will reach Bayo. We will give it to him at the end here. So just jumping right in, there was you're very gifted in teasing the hook. So there were these slides near the end that talked about white syncopation. You said this is very, very important, which you told us also to be suspicious about at the beginning. And then you said, but I don't have time to talk about it. Now, I want to ask, I want to ask, what is white syncopation? What is syncopation, potentially? And bringing in some of the questions that may have been related to that, there was a question of does whiteness have a genealogy worth tracing?
Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. In a conversation with a brother that I need not name, we had, many conversations. We would speak about white supremacy, right? And again, I want you to not think about whiteness as the things that white bodies do, as much as you might be maybe to be brought to a place to consider that whiteness is a performance, right? It's a performance that enlists bodies of different capacities and kinds, whatever you want to call it, into how it materializes. So whiteness is very relational, and as such, it is vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable. When we speak about, many people speak about white supremacy as this metallic dome, right? That is, it's there. It's already there. It's objectively standard. It is beyond our perception. There's something very troubling and Newtonian about that idea. So my idea of white syncopation is to bring it down to earth, right? It's to bring whiteness down to fungi and mushrooms and soil, and to notice that it is part of what the world is doing. It is risky, it is dangerous, it is creating and excluding and doing all kinds of funny things. But the last thing I want to call it is it's not evil. Immediately you start to think about whiteness as an evil, there's nothing else to be said. You've ended the conversation. Immediately you essentialize it as an evil to be expunged. You're participating in white continuity, right? So I never speak about whiteness in that way. So syncopation is all the ways the counter-hegemonic, counter-plantation, counter-institutional ways that the world upsets whiteness, that our bodies are no longer available for its project. Right? Even exhaustion is potentially fugitive, right? Even rest could be a syncopating force. Syncopation comes from music theory, like rhythm theory. Anyone likes jazz here? Everyone likes jazz. It's really? Okay, that's a demographic. Jazz folks. I know how to train this now. Yeah, so in music theory, right, you have the downbeat and the upbeat, groove and rhythm, right? The downbeat is usually marked by the kick drum, right? And the upbeat is marked by the hi-hat, right? Like you could have the imperial march of the downbeat with no upbeat upsetting it. But when the upbeat is introduced, then there's rhythm, right? There's danceability, right? Syncopation is the introduction of danceability, right? If you want to stay with the stereotypes, right? Let's play with the stereotypes that white people can't dance, right? Let's just play with that stereotype. It's obviously untrue, but stay with that stereotype for a moment, that white people can't dance, right? Syncopation is how whiteness dances, right? It's how whiteness starts to move off its imperial rigidity. So I would like to explore with folks all the ways that the world is upsetting colonial settlement. How the world itself, not people acting upon the world, again, it's how the world is inviting and upsetting all the institutional frameworks that we feel is stabilized. This happens psychically, ecologically, corporally, ecologically, economically, all the ways that we're not sure or confident, all the ways we're losing a handlehold on the future, right? And so that white syncopation becomes this opportunity for us to dance in the cracks, to experiment with failure. Failure here is not inadequacy, it's excess. There's so much more in the room, and our work is to host that excessiveness. That's in a nutshell, which I don't like nutshells, but white syncopation. Yes.
Building on this theme of fugitivity,
Yes.
there is, you've pointed to the ways in which the project of modernity itself is a history of attempts to domesticate and tame the monsters.
Yeah.
To embrace a practice of fugitivity can risk subverting itself if it becomes its own project.
Yes.
And so there were some questions about how to practice fugitivity in a way that doesn't end up domesticating itself. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
It's always going to be a risk, and I don't think we can escape this. We can be cautious about it. You know that saying about today's revolution becoming tomorrow's industry, or something like that, right? It's like, down with capitalism. Get your down with capitalism t-shirts, something like that. It's right. All the ways, I want to leave some room for the laughter to, okay. All right. All the ways that the minor gesture can be fetishized, institutionalized, and made into a standard, right? I'm very wary about offering people, now, if you do this bodily practice, and we need bodily practices, but if you do this bodily practice, just do this every day, put it on your to-do list, and you're fine. I'm very wary about giving people standardized products, right? And that's the reason why I shy away from answers. Like, I want to move people in such a way that they seek out new kinds of logics and experiment with new kinds of forms. So yes, brother, that is always a risk. I don't want to say that fugitivity is completely amenable to human practice. I want to say that we are called into spaces of fugitivity. It's when we are no longer available, right? It's when even our bodies are revolting, or no, that's not a word, refusing the frameworks of productivity, right? You know the story I always tell about ants in a death spiral? I tell it all the time. Very fascinating biological phenomenon of ants getting stuck in a circle. They just go around in a circle, they keep on walking in a circle, just for days on end, and they get exhausted and they die in the circle because of some pheromonic secretion, an accident of some kind, and they're stuck in there. One of the theoretical ways they can break out of the circle is if they're infected by Ophiocodiceps unilateralis, a fungus that infects them, and they stray away from every legibility. They stray away from ant society, and they become hybridized. My point here is we all, in small doses, in small homeopathic doses, are becoming hybridized. We're becoming monster, we're becoming stranger, we're becoming less available to the ways that surveillance capitalism marks us, archives us, renders us useful, right? The pandemic brought that to the fore in a very powerful way. There were multiple movements. I don't know if you heard about them. What, slow life? What was that again? There was one slow life. There's the lie down movement. Yeah, the lie down or lie flat movement in Japan, or is it China? The governments don't like this, right? Young people are supposed to be going to the shopping malls and being useful, right? Instead, you're lying down. And all of this, because of this instigation, this crack that immediately questioned the logics of productivity. So fugitivity is not just something to fit into your to-do list. Like, I'm going to be fugitive on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? Maybe on Sundays I'll give some time to being fugitive. No, that's not what I'm talking about. It's not another practice, not another arrow in your quiver full of arrows. It is a vocation of the planet. My brother here speaks about planetary consciousness, Gaia, right? And you should listen to Alex speak about that more eloquently than I could ever speak about it. Like that there's a way the planet itself is calling us into different kinds of patterns and vocations. And I feel that's what our time is about.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
There's the story of the fish, the two fish swimming down the river and passing by an older fish who says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And one turns to the other and says, "What's water?" And that's a story of realizing that we are in water, realizing that we are part of another, a larger world, a world that exceeds us. There's also the famous poet that wrote that the rose is without why. And that when you speak of going beyond legibility and resisting being placed into a category and seeing everything under the value of purpose, that idea that the rose is without why always comes to mind for me. I'm curious for you, you talked about needing to move in our bodies, and so you're talking about going beyond legibility in a way that's more than just resisting, more than just a conceptual realization. You're talking about being in a different way. And I'm curious if you can talk about this beyond story, beyond words, beyond purpose type of being that we're invited to experience and give ourselves to.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to frame this idea, you know, what you said about the fish, right? I wish I started that way. It would have made things easier for me, just that, what's water? I hope some of us heard that what I mean by the sensorium is exactly a response to that question, what's water, right? All the things we're swimming in, but we don't notice or appreciate or apprehend is the water. That's the sensorium. And in a sense, you know, what was the other part of the
rose is without why.
Yes, and the other part, again,
how can we
move
give
beyond
ourselves
legibility.
into movement beyond legibility?
Yeah, so it's, this is what white syncopation addresses. This is what this theory addresses, that we are not as stable as we think. We are not as well put together as we think. In fact, we practice neurotypicality every day. In our waking moments, we practice this. A brother that's coming to the carnival, name is Orland Bishop. He says, I wish I can mimic his deep voice. Every time I wait, no, I'm not going to do it. But he says this thing about that there is an infra-thin moment between when he wakes up and when he becomes a black man. Right? There's this very tiny moment. It's vanishingly small. It's minor, but it's this space between when he realizes. Have some of you maybe traveled to a different time zone and you're in the hotel? As I've done several times, you're at a hotel and you wake up and you're like, you're not just saying, where am I? Or where is the time? You're like, who am I? right? I don't know if you've ever been in a state of exhaustion where you're like, wait, what am I doing? Who is this and what am I? Who is this? What's happening? What is happening here? I've been in many situations like that where the world hasn't yet come together, right? This is what autistic perception allows us to notice, that the world hasn't fully congealed into subjects and objects, right? This is not simply a table. This is a potential. This is not a thing as much as it is a performance, a practice. And I'm co-practicing with this in the postures I adopt. See, children know how to approach the world that makes it, in a way that makes it liquid and fluid. Well, not to Alethea now. Alethea is growing up, and some of the things that may have been play to her are no longer playful to her. But when Alethea was a lot younger, she would get into a cardboard box, maybe we ordered something, and we disposed of the contents, and she'll get into it and she'll say, "This is my spaceship," or something like that. Now, she wasn't lying. She meant it. She's serious that she is now in a spaceship or she is in some beast of some kind, right? Children know how to play with the world. That is what autistic perception allows us. So when you speak about going beyond legibility, I'm saying that legibility is a trap. White modernity is the urge to keep on being legible, available, recognizable, to be seen. And you see, most of our activisms are premised on the idea that if we're not seen enough, if we're not recognized, then we're failed. We need to be recognized, we need to be seen. I'm not dismissing that, but like I said earlier, if our work is exclusively based on being recognized, then we are risking being legible within paradigms that are oppressive. And if you use the epistemological resources of your incarceration to address your incarceration, you risk reinforcing your incarceration. Does that make some sense? Okay. The one about Superman. So Clark Kent, I'll just in a moment. If you risk using the resources of your incarceration to address your incarceration, you risk reinforcing those conditions, something like that. Yeah.
One of the types of incarceration that we can risk falling back into is the incarceration of the self, yes, or a certain kind of self. Yes. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on selfhood. Yes. And is the project of the self itself problematic, or is there a different way of being self, yes, that you are pointing to?
It's not, I don't think it's the problem. It is potentially problematic within a sensorium, right? I just feel that specific performances of selfhood often get exhausted and wear out their space, right? Most of us like to think it's a matter of ego. Let's get rid of the ego. I'm like, that's exactly what the ego wants to do, right? Like, oh, I want to get rid of the ego. Like, you can't get rid of the ego. It's not like, it's not like getting rid of the ego. It's more of thinking along the lines of one of my favorite philosophers, Gilbert Simondon. So Simondon has this idea of the pre-individual. And he thought of selves as processes, right? The self is a process. It's not that we are individuals, it's that we're individuations. It's an ongoing performance. Again, this is something that processual or process-oriented thinkers know something about. Vicky can say a lot about this, with Whitehead and all that. So it's not that the self or selfhood is the thing to exorcise. It's that modern selfing, I'm making it a gerund, right, a continuous thing. Modern selfing is comorbid with the anthropogenic realities that we're finding deeply problematic. This is the reason why I feel Carnival addresses some of this, because carnival has to do with where we cut the flesh. Carnival literally means farewell flesh, goodbye flesh. You know, it has to do with Lent, and I mean the Brazilians alchemized the Portuguese Lent traditions and Catholic traditions with samba, and it became carnival. But one interpretation of carnival is the cutting of the flesh away. But a brother, Dougald Hine, recently wrote to me and said, Bayo, I think carnival is also hello flesh, right? It's not just farewell to meat or flesh. It's also welcome to my cousins, my siblings that I've never known before, to my larger body, right? So in these times, we need ways of meeting ourselves as if for the first time, right? You are not the isolated Newtonian atomic entity that your furniture presumes you are, or that your vehicle presumes you are, or that consumerist enterprises presume you are, or that electropolitics, one man, one vote, presumes you are. You are more than that. You spill beyond those categories and boundaries. Again, just dancing to the side a bit, our activisms are committed to seeking out categoricity. Everyone wants to be a capital letter. No one wants to be a part of the sentence, right? We all want to start the sentence. Categoricity, to be seen, to be ideologically pure. And that's why a lot of the tensions between the left and the right is around the anxiety of what do we do with excess. That's the space that I feel is opening out for us as a species. And the call of the carnival is to experiment with new edges of selfhood and becoming.
On this theme, you speak and write about posthumanism and posthumanist, which is a phrase that is becoming increasingly visible, but also stands in a milieu in which there are people advocating for transhumanism. Posthumanism is not transhumanism, but what is it? What is posthumanism? What do you mean by that?
Okay, an easy way to see this, transhumanism is Elon Musk. Transhumanism is like a hyper intensification of anthropocentric tendencies, right? What if we could control how we feel? What if we could operationalize life well enough that we have the reins, the handle on death itself? We could live eternally. And if I'm feeling sad at one moment, I could click on an app speculatively and feel happy in that moment. What if we could control everything? Some kind of spiritistic psychic singularity. So transhumanism is humanism on steroids, you might say. Posthumanism is of a different, softer orientation that I feel is not reducible to indigenous insights, but tracks very well along with what black scholars and feminist materialists and ecologists and people who study ants and people who stay in the fields have known for quite some time. That we are not alone, we are not the center of the picture, there isn't a stable picture to begin with. So it's this idea of decentering humans. We want to decenter humans from how the world works. We want to say, for instance, that we don't have consciousness, right? It's not something to have, reducible to brain states. It's that consciousness could be a field, operationally alive, and, enlisting different kinds of materials in how it comes to matter. Maybe with that kind of humility, we notice that our computer systems may have secret lives and careers, and that AI may be watching you, not in the insidious way, but that it's possibly alive, and that things are alive in a very, very profound way. That is the idea of posthumanism. Well, it's not the idea, but I mean, this is a field. Posthumanism is not one thing. There are many posthumanisms, some of which are contradictory. Object-oriented ontologies will possibly never agree with agential realism of Karen Barad. So this is a field of experiments and contentions. But what tracks along all these ideas is that we are not all that. We are not all that. You feel that you made that decision? No, it was a virus or some bacterium in your microbiome that made that decision for you. And maybe it's not even that bacteria. Maybe it was a virus, bacteriophage. My wife has been teaching me about viruses and stuff. So maybe it's something on the bacteria that made the decision. Maybe it's something on the thing that's on the bacteria that made the decision. You see, it's elephants all the way down. And that's posthumanism, that we live in a relational world, and if you ever come to a place of essentialized finality, then look again, because there's still more road. That's the idea.
Yeah. You invite us to lose our way. And
Well, not me. Yoruba people.
There's a process of disorientation.
Yeah.
That comes, which we are encouraged to lean into.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of the questions that were offered up had to do with the relationship between this vulnerable place and what faith has been. Now, faith can be distorted into belief, but there is a question of is the practice of stepping off into cracks and sitting with monsters a type of faith for the 21st century? Is there and what role does trust and courage and faith play in these practices, or are those also words that we should leave behind as we step off and seek new words?
Well, that's a beautiful question. I think of faith as some kind of symbiogenesis, right? It's almost like a fidelity between bodies. In other words, let me put it this way. Faith is a living vocation that guides bodies into coalitions, into how they build coalitions. And I just want you to recognize that you are a coalition. You are a coalition of heterogeneous materials. You are not whatever your name is. That's just a label. Instead, you are a federation of multiplicities that will never be fully united, right? Never be fully integrated. And that's actually a very, very amazing, striking, fugitive, poetic thing, that you're dispersed and you're dispersing. So the idea of getting lost and faith here, I see faith as how bodies borrow other bodies in order to meet the complexity of the universe, right? Alex, you probably can think about symbiogenetic alliances between animals. You know, maybe you can think of some yourself. How examples have just gone out of my head. I'm probably very hungry. But examples of very strange relationships between maybe a crocodile and some kind of bird. The crocodile never eats the bird because the crocodile needs the bird to live, and the bird needs the crocodile to cross the river or something. I don't know. Just there's always this strange relationship between species. We are also an interspecies process. So when I speak about faith, I speak about an interspecies process. Maybe you could think about cracks as an interspecies invitation, right? That there's something cartographically complex here that is inviting a different kind of posture, right? Don't keep on walking straight. or when you come here, I always tell people that blackness is the vocation of navigating thresholds. Modernity is the erasure of thresholds, right? When you get to that tree, duck or bow or step or something or crip walk, I don't know, just when you get to a place, acknowledge it. Contrast that with modernity's impulse. Flatten that mountain. We're going to put up a shopping mall there. Flatten this river. Create a condominium here. You see, modernity flattens worlds, whereas the kind of politics we're speaking about here is one that recognizes that there's a thing to do and there are things not to do. There are places to go and there are times when you should shut up. You don't speak all the time, for instance, in front of elders where I come from. An elder speaks, you keep quiet. Of course, that is problematic in different ways, but there are thresholds all the same. So a crack is a threshold of some kind, brother. And I think that you could think about approaching the threshold as a kind of faith process, like we're being called to build alliances there. There's always the risk, however, of covering the cracks. We do that well. We know how to do that very well. We know how to get back to normal. Does it feel like that? Like something happens back to normal. I think there was a campaign here in the United States for back to normal or back to something after the pandemic, post-pandemic, like back to Netflix or something, I don't know. Back to life as we know it. That is, of course, needed, possibly desired, but is limited in meeting a world that is more complex than our efforts to restore recognizability. I'll just stop there for now.
You have spoken and written about post-activism.
Yes.
You've talked about unlearning your own whiteness.
Yes.
And you have invited us to try to find, make, and share cracks in the world.
Yes.
In times of chaos and crisis and violence and destabilization. And so what can we, for those who are motivated to respond to the crisis and do not want to perpetuate the crisis, but who are moved to do something, where should we direct our energy, or is that the wrong framing of the question?
No, it isn't. I think that's a useful framing, brother. Something I didn't get to say that I wish I said or had time to say during the presentation was that morality is something thermal. There's something viscous about morality. I distinguish between morality and ethics in my work. Morality is a coalition of rules and regulations and all of that. It's how bodies are made practical. It's how we gain legibility, right? Ethics, on the other hand, is how the world flows. It's not available for affixations or fidelities with good or evil. It's the world in its orgasmic, becoming, right? In other words, ethics is how morality bleeds, right? Morality is the settlement. Ethics is the crack, is an eruption that breaks moral strangleholds and invites new kinds of considerations. That's what post-activism is, in another very inconvenient nutshell. That post-activism is the eruption that occurs that immediately draws our attention to notice that maybe being good is not enough. Maybe being sensuous is the thing we need to practice here, right? It's maybe all the forward movement and marching and all of that, while needed, maybe it's getting in the way, and maybe some other kinds of projects and possibilities and politics is possible here. So that's what I think about as post-activism, the breaking of the container, the cookie cutter models, the notions of goodness, the notions of responsibility, the notions of ideological purity that immediately draws our attention to what I theorize as cracks. So to people who are wondering, what do we do? What do we do now? I would say we are already in movements of doing. Even the question is a form of doing. Was a conversation I had with Vicky a while ago. I never try to demarcate or separate theory from practice. What we did here today was carnival, right? What we did here today was exploring new edges. We're already in the carnival. We are doing this together already. So this is perhaps a deeper invitation for us to find experimental ways of sharing our excess, our failure. What might that look like in your locality, your neighborhood? Maybe it looks like a carnival. Maybe it looks like gathering once a week. Maybe it looks like a phone call. It doesn't matter the container, so long as you host the minor gesture, so long as you find a way to host and infect, right? I think transformation is epidemiological. You have to infect and be infected by. The reason why I speak about infection a lot. So maybe that's the invitation now. Don't be bothered about what it looks like. Just play with it. Take those monsters out. Set your basket, whatever, in the field. Put a mat. Sit down. Have a picnic with your monster. Have conversations. Interview the monster. Go swimming together as well as I do. I swim great. I don't. And then see what happens. Somewhere in the feedback loop of engaging the monstrous, we are changed, I think. Somewhere there, new subjectivities emerge from staying with that troubling monstrosity. And that's how the cookie crumbles.
Please join me in thanking sensuously Bayo Akomolafe. Thank you, everyone.